Actually, there are a couple of very nice verses on this topic in Upadesa Saram, which is the essence of instruction, 30 verses. The work by Bhagavan, that's 30 verses. So, verse 16 of the essence of instruction, we're talking about what true knowledge is, true wisdom. Here they use the word wisdom. It's again a synonym for knowledge. Verse 16 of Upadesa Saram. It is true wisdom for the mind to turn away from outer objects and behold its own effulgent form. It's true wisdom, true knowledge. It is to turn away from outer objects and behold your own true effulgent form. It says for the mind to turn away from objects and behold its own effulgent form, because the mind, when it's attending to objects, is called mind. And when it's no longer attending to objects and it's just resting as it is, it's called the self. The ego, which is the jiva means ego, it means the person, individual person, or the apparent appearance of an individual person, the jiva. The jiva is looking at objects. And when the jiva stops looking at objects and rests in itself, the jiva becomes Shiva, the self. The jiva is really Shiva. The ego is actually the self. So when you go back to what you truly are, you discover yourself. That's verse 16. It is true wisdom for the mind to turn away from outer objects and behold its own effulgent form. Effulgent. What does effulgent mean? It means shining. It means glowing. It means throbbing and vibrating with light. Now the self is beyond all description. It cannot be expressed into words. So when we see these kinds of words, effulgent form, we have to realize what this means. This is a metaphor. It means effulgent form means formless. The form of light is formless. It's not actually a light. It's beyond light and dark, but it's what you are. And these words have a wonderful resonance to them. Your being, your beingness, which is beyond description, we can say it's like light, shining, glowing like the sun of suns. Is that which lights up even the sun. That's verse 16 of Upadesa Saram. There's another, gosh, I'm going to read everything. Here, I was going to read verse 27, and then I saw verse 26. I think I'll read that one too. Then I saw verse 25. I think I'll read that one too. Here we go, verse 25. Seeing oneself free of all attributes. Attributes means what? It means forms. It means objects. It means perceptions. It means thoughts. Right? Do you see how these words are synonyms? Maya, objects, forms, thoughts. These are all synonyms. Remember, there are only two concepts in the teaching: reality and illusion. What the self and objects, the self and Maya. That's it. So all these words are pointing to one of these two things. Seeing oneself free of all attributes is to see the Lord. That means God, the source. Seeing oneself free of all attributes is to see the Lord, for he shines ever as the pure self. This is verse 25 of Upadesa Saram. Upadesha means teaching or instruction or spiritual teaching, spiritual instruction. And Saram means the essence. So Upadesha Saram means the essence of the spiritual teaching, the essence of instruction, the essential teaching, a distillation of the teaching in 30 verses. That was verse 25. Seeing oneself free of all attributes. That means without any thoughts, without any objects, without maya, without ignorance, without the jiva. Maya, jiva, thoughts, objects, ego. These are all synonyms. Seeing oneself free of all attributes is to see the Lord. The Lord? Where? The Lord? Where is this Lord? What is this Lord? For he shines ever as the pure self. You. That was verse 25. Verse 26. You might have heard this kind of verse already today. Verse 26. To know the self. How do we know the self? Can you guess? To know the self is but to be the self. He's not saying this is something you know with the mind. That's the point. It's not, oh, I know the self. Tom knows the self. Or someone knows the self. No. There's no Tom in the self. There's no anyone in the self. There's only the self. To know the self is but, it's a bit like that word merely that we saw in another verse. Merely to be the self. To know the self, excuse me, to know the self is but to be the self, for it is non-dual. Why has Bhagavan said to know the self is but to be the self, and then written, for it is non-dual? Why is Bhagavan written this at the end? For it is non-dual. What's he saying? Do you think about that when you read these verses? To know the self is but to be the self, for it is non-dual. He's saying to know the self, it's not you knowing something else. That's dual. That's dualistic. A knower and a known. A knower and a known, a subject and an object. That's dualistic. That's duality. He's saying no. The self is non-dual. Self-knowledge is non-dual knowledge. It's not knowledge in the ordinary sense of the word, knowing something with the mind, with the brain, with the intellect. No. To know the self is but or only to be the self. For it is non-dual. There is no subject, object, knower, known, knowledge. No dyads and triads. The dyads are the subject, object, knower, known. The triads are the subject, object, and verb. What the verb means, the doing, the action. So knower would be the subject. Object would be known, the known. There's no knower, there's no known, and there's no knowing. There's no knowing. All these are to do with the ego, the mind. In the self, there's an absence of knower, knowing, and known. There is just being. The self. Just the self being itself, which is not a doing. It's not a karma. Karma means doing or action. There's no action. There's no karma in the self. Karma means maya. If you realize that. Karma means objects. It means movement. Objects means movement. Karma means time. Karma means doing. It means cause and effect. There can be no karma unless there are objects. There can be no time unless there are objects. Objects means time. Time means ego, means Maya. And the self is timeless, timeless, no time. Objectless, no objects. Devoid of thought, no thought. Pure knowledge is the nature of the self. The word knowledge is just a synonym for self. Self-knowledge just means the self. We don't need to use the word knowledge. To know the self is but to be the self. This is verse 26 still. For it is non-dual. In such knowledge, one abides as that. Why do these scriptures keep on calling it that? With a capital T. Why? Have you thought this? Why? It's because how can you describe that which cannot be described? Or a word like that is pretty nondescript. It's pretty nondescript as you can get, indicating something with as minimal qualities as possible. Right? Not he, not she, not the heart, not the self, not subject, not object, no knowing, beyond what that. You see, you can't describe it. So what can I call it? That. That's what it is. It's that. It's you. It's the self. That thing which we cannot name, that has no name, cannot be put into words. I'll just call it that because there's no way to speak of it. So we'll just call it that. It's almost insolent, rude, offensive, isn't it? To call God that. If I refer to you as it or that, you might not be very happy with me. If someone said, oh, what did so-and-so say? If someone said, what did Sarah say? And I said, oh, it said this. That thing said this, that thing said that. You might not be very happy with me. Sarah might be thinking, why is he, that's a bit rude, isn't it? He's calling me it and that thing. That's what that refers to, isn't it? It's a thing. But here we refer to the Supreme as that. Because the Supreme is devoid of qualities beyond description. So it's beyond description. Often, I was going to say its only nature is being. But you will actually see in the scriptures that the self is beyond being and non-being. Have you read that anywhere? Have anyone come across that? The self is beyond being and non-being. Well, there are only two concepts in this teaching. Have I told you that before? Have you heard that before? So if the self is beyond being and non-being, what must being and non-being refer to? Must refer to objects, Maya, things, appearances, right? There are two concepts, subject and object, self and Maya. Subject and objects, rather. Subject is one. We all feel we are one. And objects are many that we feel. This is the ignorance. And the teaching says actually, one of these concepts, the subject, is actually the only thing there is the reality. And what you see before you as objects is actually non-existent illusion. It doesn't even exist. So when you discover the truth of the subject, you can't even call it a subject. We call it the subject just as an orientation device for the ego, for the jiva. But you see, it's beyond being and non-being. Being and non-being refers to objects. in this case. When we say the self is beyond being and non-being, we say it's beyond an object which can be or not be. You know, maybe birds exist, so they are, and dinosaurs don't exist, so they don't exist anymore. They're non-being. So it's beyond things that exist and don't exist, beyond the objects. Do you see? Right, this is the verse I was actually going to read, verse 27. That is true knowledge, which transcends both knowledge and ignorance. That is true knowledge, which transcends both knowledge and ignorance. For in pure knowledge, there is no object to be known. So we string these three verses together, verses 25, 26, 27. The teaching becomes very clear if you think about these verses. Verse 25, seeing oneself free of all attributes is to see the Lord, for he shines ever as the pure self. Verse 26, to know the self is but to be the self, for it is non-dual. No, knower, known. In such knowledge one abides as that. Verse 27, that is true knowledge which transcends both knowledge and ignorance. What's it transcending? Knowledge of objects, ignorance of objects, the mind that knows, the mind that doesn't know. It's transcending the mind, the knowledge in the mind, intellectual knowledge, which always goes hand in hand with ignorance. The mind can know things and the mind can not know things. That's knowledge and ignorance of the mind. That is true knowledge which transcends both knowledge and ignorance. For in pure knowledge, pure, the word pure again is there, right? Meaning no object. For in pure knowledge, there is no object to be known. I'm going to carry on. Verse 28. Having known one's nature, does that mean you know something? Does that mean I, Tom, know something? No. It's just to be pure consciousness. Verse 28. Having known one's nature, one abides as being, with no beginning and no end, in unbroken consciousness and bliss. There's three words in this verse: being, consciousness, and bliss. Bhagavan has threaded these three words together in the sentence. Did you spot that? Being, consciousness, bliss. Sat, Chit, Ananda. Do you see that? You see how he's threaded these together in this verse? In verse 28. Having known one's nature, which we should be clear now, is just to be, without any thoughts, without any objects. And when we're without thoughts and objects, we are full of happiness, because that's our nature. When objects appear, we are not happy. We're either pleasure or pain, pleasure, pain, this kind of thing. Samsara, Maya. But when objects are not there, we're full of bliss. Having known one's nature, one abides as being, with no beginning and no end, in unbroken, that word unbroken again, means no objects, in unbroken consciousness and bliss. No beginning, no end, beyond no time, you see? Unborn. No beginning can mean unborn. No end can mean no death. Having known one's nature, one abides as being, with no beginning and no end, in unbroken consciousness and bliss. Verse 29. Oh yes, so abides as being, that's the Sat. In unbroken consciousness, that's the Chit. And bliss, Ananda. So Sat, Chit, Ananda, these are three words to describe that which we cannot describe, the self. They're not three separate things. Verse 29. Abiding in this state of bliss, beyond bondage and release, is steadfastness in service of the Lord. Abiding in this state of bliss, beyond bondage and release, beyond ignorance and liberation. The idea of liberation is an idea for the mind. And the idea of freedom and release from bondage is itself an idea of Maya, of ignorance. The idea of liberation itself is an ignorant notion. We talk about it for the purposes of the teachings, but in self-knowledge, in abiding as the self, in liberation, there is no liberation. It's just the self. Just like when we discover what we are as a subject, there's no longer a subject anymore because there's no object. So in reality, there is no liberation or ignorance in anything. None of these things. These are all Maya. These are all appearances, aren't they? Abiding in this state of bliss, beyond bondage and release, is steadfastness in service of the Lord. Means this is the true service to God. This brings us back to the first verse that Sylvie read to us. Which is this: is there any way of adoring the Supreme, which is all, except by abiding firmly as that? So we see the path of inquiry and the path of devotion are the same, because to be what you truly are, the formless, absolute, devoid of objects, devoid of objectivity, devoid of multiplicity, just one, that is the true service to God. And that is the true knowing what you are. Last verse. All ego gone. This is verse 30. All ego gone. That means all of Maya gone. All the objects gone. All appearances gone. All multiplicity, duality gone. Multiplicity and duality are synonyms in this teaching. All ego gone. All of that gone. Living as that alone. That means it's abiding as pure consciousness only. All ego gone. Living as that alone is penance good for growth. Sings Ramana, the self. He's saying the penance good for growth. Penance means the practice. I think that's probably a translation of tapas. I don't know that for sure. I could be wrong. But tapas is this Sanskrit word which is often translated as penance. It means spiritual practice, sadhana. It means austerities. Austerities is a literal translation. Austerities are a type of spiritual practice that are austere. Austere means not flamboyant. Yeah, it means stripped back, bare. So tapas is penance, they translate it as here. But it doesn't have to be so bad. This is penance. I don't know. It's got a negative ring to it. At least to me, it has. You know, it's like you have to pay a debt, and it's like punishment, like a penalty. But here, this is the sadhana. This is the practice. All ego gone, living as that alone. That means just being what you are, abiding as pure beingness, consciousness, bliss. Living as that alone is penance good for growth, is the sadhana that good for growth that develops us, I would say, is the spiritual practice that develops us. So I'll rephrase this verse in my language. All ego gone means all Maya gone, all objects gone. Living as that alone, just being pure being alone, without any arising thoughts or attributes or objects. Is penance good for growth? Is the sadhana, is the spiritual practice that will develop us. will nurture us, will nourish us. That's it. This will nourish us. Sings Ramana, sings our beloved Guru Bhagavan, the self. Who is Ramana? He is that. So, I don't often read that many quotes, but maybe it's good to do that once in a while. Thank you, Karen. Maybe it's good to do that once in a while. Thank you, Sarah. Because it just reminds us that what I'm sharing is actually Bhagavan's teaching. And that's important to me. Because I want to reveal, I want to share with you Bhagavan's teaching. And by reading the things that, the very quotes that he himself has written, it's not that somebody else recorded him saying these, the quotes that I've given to you. Most of the quotes I've given to you, he wrote himself. The ones from Uludunapadu, he wrote himself. The ones from Upadesa Saram, he wrote himself. Uludunapadu, 40 verses on reality. Uladu means the reality. It means that which exists, that which has being. Uladu means that which is the reality. And Narpadu means 40. So it just means the 40 reality, or the 40 on reality. That's how the title is. It's the 40 on reality. Yeah? Reality 40, 40 reality, 40 verses on reality. It's so terse and concise, they don't even bother putting the word verses in, right? It's just the 40. It's like, in the charts, the top 40. The top 40. We don't say it's the top 40 songs of the present time, do we? We say top 40. And everyone knows what you mean. This is a bit like that. It's the 40 on reality. These guys, they're so immersed in their spirituality. They know it's the 40 verses. You don't have to say verses. The 40 on reality. Uladu Narpadu. Reality, 40. Reality in 40. And then those verses were all penned by Bhagavan himself. And then Upadesa Saram, the essence of the teaching, the essential teaching. These are all, again, written by Bhagavan. In the second half of the text, the second 15 verses, we get the real explanation of self-inquiry. In the first 15 verses, he's explaining the 4 yogas because of the context in which these verses were written. I think Sri Sadhuwan talks about that, if you're interested. So again, see how simple the teachings are. See how they say the same thing again and again and again in different words. Just to be. This is knowledge. To be what you truly are. Just to be. This is devotion. This is true. This is the highest form of devotion. Para bhakti. Bhakti means devotion. Para kind of means the highest, or the ultimate, or the supreme. Para kind of means supreme bhakti, the highest form of bhakti. Para bhakti. sometimes you might hear things like Brahman and Parabrahman. Parabrahman means the supreme Brahman, the highest form of Brahman. The lower Brahman being the Maya, right? Ignorance, objective reality, the universe, the body, mind, and world. The higher Brahman being your true self, which is devoid of these.